Welcome to a new edition of the Neon Jazz interview series with jazz drummer, composer, conductor, and teacher, the great Paul Yonemura. Based out of Berkeley, California these days, Paul is a lifelong learner, educator, and performer. He just released a new long-awaited 2016 CD called Coming Back Home, and it's a great listen. It's starting to take off, and he's very excited about it. Over the course of our conversation, we talked about his jazz journey, why he loves jazz so much, and many more things. So get to know Paul and dig this interview, my friends.
Thank you for taking some time to join me today.
Sure.
It's my pleasure. So, I'm going to go ahead and dive right in here. I have a pretty good idea based on your website of things that are going on, but I want to know from you, give me kind of a snapshot of some of the activity that's been going on in your world lately.
Oh, wow. Well, aside from turning 65 yesterday and getting about 300 birthday greetings from former students, friends, etc., that's pretty amazing. Education, being in education as long as I was, it's still paying back a real huge dividend that way. I'm still hearing from a lot of students. And I think social media has been really great for that. And, I'm slowly ramping back into playing again. It takes a little time. And, of course, things are quite different than when I left the scene in 1985. So slowly but surely, I think the CDs are helping, too, in that regard. But I play regularly with a Kicks big band led by saxophonist Rory Snyder. And we're actually on a record with a singer named Dale Head that came out last year. I think about mid-year, Dale finally got it out. And so that was a lot of fun doing that. And between that and having the initial CD release on Chirag Records, Reunion Trios, coming out early last year, I found I was in for me, an unusual position of being on two releases. And now I'm on a third with my own, with Coming Back Home coming out. And it's been a lot of fun watching both the CDs hit the radio airplay and getting positive responses from folks like you.
Yeah, and I love the new album, and I want to know what kind of, I'm assuming from your bio and your history and getting back into the scene, I understand what Coming Back Home means. But explain to me what this album means to you and what went into it.
Well, it started out as a couple of just fun sessions. I wasn't really intending to do anything. As you know, when you put something out independently, you're lucky to break even on these things if you get that far. My first record was an LP called First Flight Home. That came out in 1985. And no, I didn't break even on that one, but I'm glad I did it anyway. And then the friends who were on the session, which is Frank Martin on piano and Dave Dunaway on bass, and Mary Fettig played some flute on this one, but also there's a track that isn't released right now that she played alto saxophone on. They all said, okay, what are you going to do with this thing? I started laughing. I said, oh, no, not again. Sure enough, I did another session with Dave and Frank, recorded 3 more tunes, and then I did a session with John Laufenberger and Rick Helzer. Rick's tunes are all over this record, 6 of them. Rick had a group called Reawakening in Los Angeles when I was living down there, and I wound up being the drummer in that band. It came down from the Fresno area, of all places, very progressive band, and they wanted to make a change in the drum chairs. I was one of the people who had been, I had actually been gigging with Rick and John at a jam session situation in Pasadena, which is near where I was living at that time. I always liked the group's music, and I thought, gee, it's too bad Rick never got this thing, never had the financial wherewithal or whatever to get it all together, although he has put out some records of his own lately, and they're quite good, and I always found the music unusual and challenging, and so I thought it would be fun to record his music and just see what the reaction is. Unfortunately, when I finished it, which was around 1994, we did the session up in the Fresno area, this beautiful recording studio up there, believe it or not. Maximus Media has it. And it's a big studio. It's kind of like being in one of the main rooms of Fantasy Records here in the Bay Area, because I'm talking to you from Berkeley, California, just so your listeners know. Anyway, we recorded it, and there was one well-known radio/jazz critic/ education personality here in the Bay Area, whose name I won't mention. But as soon as I heard the words come out of his mouth, "This is quite a departure for you," I knew he hated it.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, that stigma kind of stuck. That was kind of the reaction of some folks back then, because as you know, smooth jazz was getting out there, and that was the big thing.
Yeah.
And so obviously this record has no place on radio. And I think jazz radio in the 1990s was in a very conservative spot. Well, it seemed like every time I tuned in on K-Jazz, which unfortunately folded up very sadly in the mid-1990s, last commercial jazz station in the country, it seemed like they weren't playing anything past 1958 or 59. I was told, this is just a little too wide open. So basically everybody was telling me, you guys play great, but the big but was there. So I made a limited run of them, sold them out of the back of my car at gigs or gave them away as calling cards. But then finally I was talking with the radio promoter, Lisa Reedy, about it, and I sent her the tracks just so she could hear it. She says, "Oh, you can get her to play with this." And I guess I am right now. I mean, and you're calling me up about this, so obviously you like it. So I'm having a lot of fun right now, proving a lot of people from about 20 years ago wrong.
There's nothing wrong with that. That's great, man. That's a great story.
It took a while. It may have taken 20 years to get this thing out there, but I figured, well, if they like Reunion Fields, let's see if they like this one. And the one thing that's come back from several radio people has been they love the energy and sizzle on this thing, because that's the thing that jumped out at me. I hadn't heard it in a while, and when I was getting ready to send it to Lisa, I played it back for myself because I hadn't heard it in a number of years. It just kind of went on the back shelf, kind of forgotten about it because of the new record and all. And then I heard it, and I thought, wow, will they like this? And apparently it's starting to gain traction, so it's nice. And I guess it helps, too, that I had a release last year. And so that's kind of paving the way. Everybody knows who I am now, and they can even pronounce my name properly.
Well, it's never too late. If you got something that you want the world to get involved with, it's just never too late. Did you grow up in the Bay Area?
Yeah, I grew up here in Berkeley, and I started out as a teenager, I started out on drums, actually quite by accident. A good family friend of ours was George Yoshida was his name. We were over at the house for quite another matter, and that was looking at this wonderful slideshow he had of a recent trip to Japan. And then I just happened to wander into his recreation room because I remember when I was very young banging on a very old set of drums that he had lying around. And the set, of course, was newer by this time. It had a beautiful, I call it the Mel Lewis color. It was a burgundy sparkle Gretsch set. It's a carbon copy of what Mel played on. Somebody else I admire greatly. And George saw me looking at it, and he says, well, I'll learn how to play. And I was 14 at the time. I said, I've been told I'm too old to start another instrument. He says, you're not too old. He said, I didn't start these till I was 29. I played saxophone before. Here. And he hands me an old pair of drumsticks and gives me the title of a book and told me where to go get it. So I wound up at Forest Music in Berkeley, and that's where I met my first drum teacher. And my whole life changed just from that one kind gesture. And George was a pretty decent amateur drummer. I mean, he would play gigs, but when I say amateur, he wasn't doing it full time. He was playing gigs and everything. He was in on the development of jazz in the public schools in Berkeley, jazz education. Herb Long, who was principal at Washington Elementary School at that time, was also George's good friend and boss, because George worked with Washington as a fifth grade teacher. And they formed this little faculty combo to help that along with having people actually come in and teaching a jazz program, much like you would teach a traditional band program, starting in the elementary grades, going up to junior high, or what we call middle school now, and then high school. And so I got to hear George play at one of these PTA meetings, and I thought, what a hip PTA meeting, because Phil Woods was playing in town that week, and he showed up and sat in and scared the bejesus out of George because of some of the tempos. And one of the parents was Vi Red. She's a wonderful saxophone player and a very fine singer. And so, head cold and all, she gets up there, plays a tune with the band, and then sings one with the band. And by that time, I was just laid out on the floor, and I thought George was a god. at that point. I'd been playing about 6 months. And so then I came up through the garage rock. I had a garage rock and roll band that I came up through because it seemed like every corner had one. Every block had one in Berkeley. And there was a lot going on with music at that time, a lot of cross-pollination. Jazz was influencing more of these guys than one could imagine. One of my favorite drummers was Jimi Hendrix drummer Mitch Mitchell. And Mitch loved Tony Williams and Elvin Jones and Art Blakey and people like that, Max Roach, Buddy Rich. I always thought he was amazing because I heard the incredible footwork he'd do at the time when guys were going to double bass drums, and including around the area. That got to be the new rage. Here I was just sticking with one, and then Mitch became my hero because I heard everything he could do with one foot. And so guys like that were influencing my listening along with my teacher, who was a local, I call him a blue-collar player very lovingly. Jack Taylor was his name, and he never really made it, quote, big, but he sure made it big in my eyes. And he had a lot of students at that time. We all still think about him. He went way too early. He died at age 51 from cancer, senior in college when that happened. That was my really first significant loss in my life. And so it took me a couple of years to get over that one because he was really more than just a teacher that I went to once a week. He was a mentor. So that's kind of this convoluted thing that I'm going through here because Jack was very much a jazz drummer, and he started talking about Elvin Jones and Mel Lewis and players like that. Max Roach was his favorite. And I was hearing these guys coming through UC Berkeley because they used to do a big jazz festival every year up at the Greek Theater. So I heard Miles Davis. I heard Tony Williams with Miles. I heard Miles and Gil Evans together. I heard Cecil Taylor. I heard Pharaoh Sanders, Cannibal, I believe, the West Coast debut of Thad Jones, Mel Lewis Band. Heard the last performance, major performance of Wes Montgomery before he died. He died about a month later.
Wow.
So, and this is a teenager taking this all in.
Yeah.
And then gradually I started, as the band wound down and came to an end before I hit college, I wound up being taken to some sessions by a friend of mine who happens to be Lenny Pickett. And Lenny was with Tower of Power on saxophone, and then now he's the band leader on Saturday Night Live. But he was quite an amazing jazz player at age 15, and so he had a friend named Bert Wilson who was kind of a freestyle avant-garde jazz musician. I remember going over to a session at Bert's apartment, and they crammed a quartet in that room. And that was my first exposure, and I played on a little Gretsch set that local drummer Smiley Winters had. And that kind of got it rolling. John Handy was another big influence, too, because I ran into him at SS State for the 1 year I was there, then off to Berkeley, and then the rest just kind of rolled out from there.
Well, talk to me a little bit about Berkeley. You leave the Bay Area, you're going from one coast to the other. That had to be some kind of level of culture shock for you. What did you learn there? What was the big growth that happened at Berkeley for you?
Well, I learned that if I was to do it all over again, I better be a heck of a lot better prepared than I was. I was going in there with a lot of heart and a lot of desire, non-reading drummer, but I don't think I could make it at Berkeley now the way they have because they've really tightened up on admission standards. But back then they allowed me to grow into the whole thing. The teachers were patient there. I had a tough first-year private teacher in Fred Buda, who was more of the classical guy there, but Freddie's a pretty darn good jazz player, too, in terms of drum set. He was drum set player on the Boston Pops for many years, as well as playing with all three orchestras in town there, the Boston Symphony, Boston Opera, and Boston Ballet, which he told me he could never do if he was living in New York. They would never allow him to do that. He'd get typecast as one player or another. And Fred was probably the most accurate sight reader I've ever seen, so he really kicked my butt.
Yeah.
And there was a guy named Greg Soinen who unfortunately passed away not long ago. Greg was the guy who taught me how to read in a big band situation, and he was one of the private teachers there also, and he took a real interest in me. Greg was one of those tough love guys, too. Yelled at me a lot, but he'd also yell at me when I got something right.
Yeah.
And in the end, we shook hands at the end there and learned a great deal. Ted Pease, the arranging teacher there, he was amazing. And then, of course, Berkeley had quite an international pool of talent coming in. Tiger Okoshu was there later on. Altafad, who came in, I think, from Australia or New Zealand. I'm trying to remember, great piano player. And then, of course, a lot of other people. Kenny Werner was there, great piano player. Tony Klocko was a writer and trumpet player. Some great drummers there. Harry Blazer was one. Jerry Califf was another. And I was watching these guys playing. I was looking up at their, trying to follow their taillights. So the standard was there. I'd say the bulk of the school was kind of like me, all trying to learn something out of it. The arranging program was amazing, so what little writing I've been able to do probably grew out of that. And Ted Pease, who was head of the arranging program, and I are still in touch. Ted was a very good drummer and had an excellent rehearsal band. And I knew what day of the week they rehearsed at school, so I was always there. And just he would let me sit next to him and read along with him, just follow the chart while he was playing it. And what impressed me one day in particular, he had just written a new piece of music for the band, and the bass player was a little lost in the middle, and Ted just very calmly stood up, kept playing one cymbal, and pointed it with his left stick to where he needed to be, and just sat right back down and got back to it. And I thought, wow, that's so cool. A drummer can write, and a drummer can help a guy out like that. And the bass player just nodded and said, thanks, after it was over, and Ted says, hey, it's tough the first time. He said, the road map's a little weird there. Tell me what I could do to fix it. That kind of thing. So it was real mutual. And I learned about all that. Like I say, and there was a lot of activity when some of the road bands would come through, particularly like Buddy Rich's band. It seemed like one time Buddy was placing about half the band when he came through. So we saw Buddy's road manager coming through and raiding Herb Pomeroy's band. Yeah, it was amazing. And also Boston's an amazing city. In a way, it's a lot like San Francisco, except for the weather. It's a seaport town, lots of history, although a much older history than San Francisco has. That was really amazing to get into that. But the other thing I found out, too, was because, while they do have a Chinatown in Boston, because so few people had exposure to Japanese Americans, everybody there at Berkeley thought I was from Hawaii. It was just unusual for them to deal with that. I don't think I faced a little bit of racism here and there, not so much at the school, but maybe outside, but it wasn't bad, and most of the teachers at school were very cool about it. I mean, my race never ever came up. Ted Pease just looked at me and saw that I was another student. Ted even encouraged me to try writing something for Herb Pomeroy's top band, and I didn't have the chops at that time, and you had writers like Jack Stock and Tony Klocko there at that time that I thought, oh man, and Kenny Werner. Kenny was a great writer, too. Thought, wow, I can't keep up with those guys. But looking back on it, darn it, you should have taken them up on it.
Yeah.
It would have at least helped you out. And even if it never quite got that far, there was somebody who thought you had something going on besides playing. And, when you're young, you get the blinders on and everything. And I look back at that now, and that's one of my great regrets. I talked to Ted about that on Facebook about it, too. And we've had a good laugh. And he's still actively writing. Fortunately, because of the back problem, he stopped playing. Which is too bad. Like I say, he was a very fine drummer. But all that had an impact. And then I made my way back to the West Coast and started teaching and teaching private lessons and starting to break in. It took a couple of years. I finally got Solomon after about 2 years. You know how that goes.
Absolutely. Well, and obviously the education bug settled in because after 17 years, from Berkeley, you went to get your master's at Northwestern University. Talk to me a little bit about what happened in that time. There's a lot of people that you played with, a lot of real-world experience. Kind of talk to me about how your career was going in between schooling.
Well, what happened was I did about 10 years of freelancing around the Bay Area and then went down to Los Angeles for another 5. And during that time, it's interesting, most of the gigs I did that I really enjoyed, it's a typical jazz musician thing. I hardly made any money off of, but I did the usual work that you survive on, playing parties, weddings, etc. I would get some recording every now and then to do, which was always fun, and that paid well. One thing I did was kind of a news themed jingle session, which was pretty wild because I was also playing timpani on that. And I thought, thank you, Fred, to Fred Budo. Because I had to figure it out real fast. They sent the wrong size temps. And I convinced the arranger, I said, look, you don't need the F up in the upper octave. You can play it on the low drum. Let me do that rather than trying to force these big drums up there. because they wouldn't go that high anyway. And so I had my first real-world experience dealing with the arranger and producer of the session. It got taken care of, and he was happy with the result. And then I played with the gig that sort of broke it open for me around the Bay Area in terms of just getting my name out there. There was a gentleman named Art Van Dam who came through, and I had the pleasure of working with Art on a 3-night engagement here in San Francisco. And Art was just a blast to work with. For listeners who don't know who he is, Art is a jazz accordion player. Very hip.
Yeah.
Yep, lots of energy. We do about 4 or 5 flag wavers a set, along with everything else, ballads, medium things. The band was all around my age. As a matter of fact, the bass player that's on Coming Back Home and Reunion Trio is one of the bass players, Dave Dunaway, was on that gig with me, so it's nice having my section mate there. And then other things started happening after that gig. I became the drummer with the Don Peistrup Big Band for about 2.5 years, 3 years. That was a rehearsal kicks band here in the Bay Area, and Don wrote a lot for Buddy Rich and became the Jingle King of Los Angeles, among other things. Great writer. The music is tremendous, and that was a great experience playing in that band with all those great veteran players. And started getting calls for other things, and I started getting particularly quite a few calls for big bands just because people found out that I could read well enough where they could bring me in with no rehearsal and sub on a gig. And in those days, it didn't scare the heck out of me. Now it does. Because, I was playing a lot back then. I just figured, and Berkeley trained you from the ground up. You make the first reading sound like you've rehearsed it for 6 months, beat into my head. So I thought, oh, okay, here's another book. Oh, manuscript's open. We'll deal with that. And I just went ahead and did it. And then I got called for certain small groups, too, that had arrangements. Art's band was one of those. Art had a mixture of arrangements as well as head tunes. And the arrangements, you really had to read them. I mean, because some of them had trick endings and things like that. And I remember Art kept making a fuss over one ending in particular that I kept nailing night after night. And his good friend who booked the gig, Joe Speck, told me, he says, Paul, you don't realize how many drummers have missed that ending. So what I realized, I was hitting a glass ceiling around the Bay Area. And so I went down to a bigger, I went down to the ocean, which is Los Angeles. And I did that for almost 5 years. And what I liked about L.A. was there were a lot of fine players to get together with that were out on the fringes like I was. But cracking into that scene, of course, as you know, is ridiculous. I played with some really incredible groups. Reawakening was one of them, Rick Helser's band. And then I played an incredible big band, probably the best big band I've ever played in down there, led by 2 young writers, Dave Metzger and Tom Calderaro. Dave now does a lot of film scoring and scored the original Lion King for Broadway. Tom is doing a lot of film editing and also film scoring, I'm assuming. Both were just terrific writers. The band was so amazing, I couldn't tell how hard the music was. Sailed through. I mean, the lead alto player was a very young Eric Marienthal. Bill Liston, who plays with Gordon Goodwin's Big Fat Band, was the lead tenor. And John Heddle was the bass player, and sometimes Sean Patitucci. And Ron Stout, who's a great jazz trumpet player, was playing the trumpet section, among others. All the lead players were ridiculously strong. So side reading with that band was a breeze. And I got the band quite by accident. I was actually subbing for somebody, and they liked my playing well enough where they asked me would I mind staying around. I guess the other guy was going out on the road at that point. And the band lasted about another 3 months, but it was the wildest 3-month ride I've ever had in a big band. And I met Gary Foster, who was the second alto player with Toshiko, and he was very encouraging. And then I would take him demo tapes of things I was doing, and he'd always give me some really good feedback. Got to know drummer Jerry Caleb down there, another good mentor and a great player. But I realized my time in L.A. had to be winding down. I kind of put a limit on it of around 5 years. And I thought, well, it looks like I'm going to be leaving, and I'm really not any closer to my goal down here other than the fact that I've met a lot of great people. So what can I do here to show that I actually learned something if I go back home? And that's when the whole idea of a first LP was hatched. And that's when First Flight Home came out in 1985. Hot on the heels of my return to the Bay Area, my students at El Cerrito High suddenly discovered they had a celebrity. Somewhat. They were following the airplay results just as much as I was. I would get something from radio and records about every week or so, and I've watched it moving up the chart. We finally wound up at number 9. And so I spent 6 years teaching at El Cerrito High. I taught orchestra, 2 wind bands, marching band, ran a show orchestra in the spring for the spring musical, and I taught one of the jazz ensembles there. And it was really amazingly fulfilling for me to watch young players develop and grow in all those genres. Plus, for me, it was great. It was such a broadening experience to conduct a small string orchestra, get into chamber literature, things like that, doing the band literature, which is quite a mess, actually, the concert band literature, and that kind of fueled the desire to be a better conductor, because I thought, I've got the ears, but the stick kind of stinks. I need to do something better with a very hot choral teacher who was very comfortable in front of all sizes of groups. And I realized, boy, I better step my game up. We had become a performing arts magnet by that time, and I guess the topper for me, the district unfortunately went bankrupt because they couldn't afford the magnet school program in the end. Our superintendent at that time had big ideas, but he overspent and overstayed his welcome. So I was given a layoff notice after 6 years, and in the meantime, my good friend Michael Brothers, who also has a good CD out right now called Reunion, Mike said, why don't you go to Northwestern? I said, I can't do the classical thing that you did there, the classical percussion major. I'm a straight drum set player. And he goes, yeah, but what about that piece of fiberglass in your hand? Why don't you go study with John Painter? And John Painter was like only the second director in the history of the school. Mr. Painter didn't have a problem taking on a guy with a jazz leaning. Actually had more of an ear for the music than I realized. He was quite a hip guy in a lot of ways. And so to be able to get in with him before he passed on about 4 or 5 years later was really amazing, because there was so much history that the man knew about. He was a guy who was around when John Philip Sousa was still touring the country with his famous band. And my El Cerrito kids decided I needed a good going-away presence, so we qualified for the Monterey Jazz Festival competition one more time. We're the first band on in the morning, and we made the night concert, which meant we were in the top 3. And we were the last band on stage, last band to get awards. And that last award was the big one. Jimmy Lyons, who was the host of the Monterey Jazz Festival, handed me the trophy for the big band division. So El Cerrito High won that year, and I had to come back right after registering at Northwestern and lead the band at the Monterey Jazz Festival in the fall. And it was such a great experience for my kids, because they got to meet Chick Corea and John Patitucci and Dave Weckl backstage along with Gillespie. And they were all just star-eyed after that. Then off to Northwestern I went, settled in, got a master's degree in conducting, but also played in the school's jazz ensemble. And the director of the band was a very hip guy named Don Owens. Dio, as we call him, has really impacted a lot of musicians. And we had a great time together. He enjoyed having a veteran drummer, because I was going back to school at age 40. Mr. Painter and Owens both liked that, because they, here's a guy who's here who's not necessarily looking for career advancement. He's here to actually learn something. I had a great time with both of them. It was nerve-wracking with Painter, because he was very demanding. But I finally figured him out. Our relationship got a lot smoother as the year went on. And by the time I did my recital, that was the final thing that sealed the deal. He got to meet my parents, who flew out for that too, and saw where I had sprung from. And he had just gotten over an angioplasty, so I was amazed he hung around for the reception. He told me, I just want to meet your parents, and then I'm going to have to head home because I need to get to bed. I said, I totally understand, sir. Go ahead. Well, half hour later, I looked across the room. He's still talking to my dad. And because my dad was extremely well-read, as was Mr. Painter, and I'm sure they were talking about more than just music. But it was really amazing to see those two old war horses talking to each other. I cherished the time with him, and then, so that's what happened in between, what kind of fueled that whole thing. And again, it was a real growing experience, because I played some incredible music school there, including the entire Bill Potts Porgy and Bess suite with the jazz ensemble. And I got to play 6 performances of the Leonard Bernstein Mass that he wrote, I guess it was in the early 1970s. He wrote it. It's an amazing work. It's about, for the drum set players, it's almost 2 hours nonstop. It's multimedia, multi-music. There was some of Bernstein's Jewish roots in there, as well as jazz, classical, and pop. There's some grooves that were definitely more on the pop or funky side of things. So I got that book in particular that really called for the heavy drum set usage. And I'm holding a whole orchestra together, plus a whole cast on stage. And Mr. Payne was conducting, and he was amazing. I was really amazed at him. Darn consistent every night.
Right on.
No problem finding where one was. And some of the stuff got in some odd meters. So following him through that, he made it real easy.
That's wonderful. Let me ask you this. We've really covered a lot of what's gone on with your teaching career and your music career. So I want to ask you this. Why do you love jazz?
I think partly because it was influencing so much of the rock music I was hearing back in the 60s. I mean, there were groups like Chicago, Blood, Sweat, and Tears. There's that group called Dreams that the Brecker Brothers had for a while. But also Jimi Hendrix, loved Miles Davis. Miles Davis loved Jimi Hendrix. Miles put out Bitches Brew after hearing Jimi Hendrix. I thought, gee, these guys are really amazing. Plus, I was just fascinated watching the jazz drummers were just really, to me, they were godlike to me. Tony Williams. I saw Tony Williams, Elvin Jones, and Buddy Rich in the same year. Three really different styles. They were all just totally amazing to me, and they were doing things that I wasn't hearing from a lot of my rock colleagues around the Bay Area. So I thought, yeah, I need to get into what these other guys are listening to. And with the help of my private teacher in the Bay Area, and then later on going off to Berkeley, and not just Freddie Buddha, but having Alan Dawson for a role model. I mean, you can't get much better than that.
Yeah, right.
Alan was Mr. Smooth. I thought, I want to look like that guy when I grow up. I just have been a better student for Alan, but that's a whole other story.
Yeah.
But Alan did teach me a lot, and one of the things he taught me was smoothness on the instrument. Be smooth, be graceful. I mean, without saying it so much, just by watching him play, I go, oh, my God, this is how everybody should play.
Let me ask you this. You've mentioned a lot of shows with a lot of iconic jazz artists that you've viewed live. So let me ask you this, along the route of nostalgia. If you could go back in time and see an act that you didn't see in real life, who would you go see?
Oh, wow. See, the funny part with me is everybody says, why don't you have more Charlie Parker in your collection? And I said, because that's not what I came up on. By the time I got into jazz, it's mid-'60s. John Coltrane and Miles Davis and all those players were very prominent. But Coltrane died, so I'd have to say two artists, if I could see them again. One would be Charlie Parker with Clifford Brown and Max Roach. I'd love to see that and see what all the fuss was. And the other one I would have loved to have seen in person would have been John Coltrane, because I missed that group. Coltrane was dead by the time I got into hearing Elvin Jones. So, of course, I went back and heard the recordings. But, boy, I'd kill to have been a fly on the wall in one of those clubs just to hear him do one of those 40-minute solos of his.
Oh, my God, yeah. That would be awesome.
And see, now here's a kicker for me. I go to the Buddhist temple here in Berkeley, and our recently departed Reverend, he's moved on to other things, but he was a huge jazz fan, and he heard Coltrane in the Midwest, some club in Ohio.
Wow.
And he heard that group, Elvin Jones, Jimmy Garrison, McCoy Tyner. And at that time, he was, I think he was an attorney or something like that before he moved into the ministry. And he says, oh, you wouldn't believe the energy. God, I thought they were so amazing. Afro Blue. And he remembered the tunes, Softly as in the Morning Sunrise, Alabama. And I thought, oh, my God, you actually heard those guys? He says, oh, yeah. Of course, that's what my kids say to me when I tell them I heard Miles in the famous quintet and the Bitches Brew Band and then the one that came after that. So they said, you heard those guys? I said, oh, yeah. I mean, I'm a very lucky guy that I came along at the time I did to hear such a spectrum of players, because Buddy came out of the swing era, was still playing remarkably right up until he died, and then I was able to hear the whole progression of Max Roach through that big festival up at Berkeley, heard him play, and was just totally blown away again. Heard Roy McCurdy playing with Cannonball Adderley. So it's just like I say, all the jazz drummers in that period I thought were just monsters. And they were. They were. They're all gods. But I've, since then, I mean, the pop and rock players really developed too, and they've got their own language now. And so I listen to anybody who's good, basically. Yeah. But yeah, if you had to pick out those jazz concerts, I also like the creativity of it. It comes out on coming back home even more than on, in my opinion, than, let's say, reunion trios. Reunion trios definitely had a lot of sparks flying, but we really opened up the gates on coming back home, particularly on Frank Martin's tune, Samba Kita. Originally, that was supposed to be a straight-ahead samba on that, and it kind of morphed into something else, which is pretty amazing to me to this day that we got it to work that way.
Let me ask you this. Everybody has their version of who you are. Your family does, your friends do, those that you teach. But who do you think you are?
You know, I get a lot of fuss made over me by my former students, particularly those who actually follow me into playing professionally or teaching professionally. And they look up to me as a real mentor. I guess I am a mentor. You could look at me that way. I think I'm a good blue-collar player who put in an on-stage work on the bandstand and then later became a really solid blue-collar teacher working in public schools, high school, middle school, elementary, who put in on-a-stage work there. Believe me, those days get long. We're talking about 12 to 16 hours sometimes. That's how I look at me, and obviously I'm a family guy, too. And, you know, I dearly love my wife, my stepson, and the grandchildren. My stepson and my daughter-in-law told me, "You are not a step-grandfather. You are their grandfather, period. End of discussion."
Yeah, nice.
Having grandchildren. So I think I'm a pretty regular guy in that regard who just happens to love getting on a bandstand somewhere and playing with somebody. So I look at myself as being pretty ordinary in a lot of ways, and yet to people from outside my body, they look at me as somebody who's done some pretty extraordinary things. So I'll let them keep saying that. It's a lot better to let them say that. You know, and also I've gone through, I've talked about the high points, but I've definitely had some low points too, both as a player and as a teacher. That keeps me grounded in that way because, hey, you know, you didn't do so hot in this situation or that situation. So don't ever allow yourself to think you're that good. Pushing, you have to know you're at a certain level of playing, I think, but find that happy medium of not wearing your ego out on your shirt sleeve. And granted, we have musicians of all walks of life, no matter what the genre, who are like that. But usually those guys, I mean, Buddy's a great example of that, or Ray Charles, or let's pick a modern drummer, a more contemporary drummer, Dave Weckl. They're very sure of themselves. They don't mind telling you about it, but they pretty much can back up what they say, too, for what they do. You know, and those guys can back it up, but I don't want to put myself in that position. I'd rather sneak up on somebody.
Yep, I hear you.
I think it's a lot better, and I think that's kind of what these CDs are doing. I think I'm slowly sneaking up on people with these CDs, and people are trying to find out a little bit more about what I do.
I agree. It's a great album. And, Paul, thank you for taking some time to talk with me today. I appreciate you opening up and giving me your story.
I appreciate you giving me this amount of time and all, and the fact that you actually looked for my website and found me.
Thanks for listening and tuning in to yet another Neon Jazz interview, where we give you a bit of insight into the finest players in New York, California, Kansas City, and spots all over the world, giving fans all that jazz. And thanks to Paul for his new music, his jazz story, and keeping that proverbial jazz torch moving. If you want to hear more interviews, go to Famous Interviews with Joe Domino on the iTunes Store, or visit theneonjazz.blogspot.com for all things Neon Jazz. Until next time, enjoy the music, my friends.
Neon Jazz.